Welcome to another episode of InRange. This is an episode about information security. It's a topic we've dealt with here over the years on InRange intermittently when time and necessity made it so, and this is one of the most important times that we could ever do a video on this topic. And this topic is OpSec, operational security, in a conflict zone. Now, I don't want you to think that this is a conclusive video. This is a primer. These are the very basics, the fundamentals of things that you need to consider. This can go far, far deeper than this, and these are not the only solutions. But in this regard, we recently heard about, actually very recently, about some photos that were leaked out of Ukraine from Ukrainian resistance and Ukrainian fighters of a picture of where they were or where they were holding up in terms of forming a base. And it turned out this information, of course, landed up on the internet. I believe it was replicated on Reddit. And as you can imagine, we are not only in a conflict that is bullets, but we are in a data war. And the Russians found that photo. And from that photo, we're able to determine some of the locations in which Ukrainian forces were using as storage locations, as well as facilities for arming up and for defense. And as a result, they focused their shelling and attacks on certain locations and probably cost many, many Ukrainian lives as a result from really just was a simple photograph. So, of course, what's going on in Ukraine right now is the greatest example of what one could consider a conflict zone. This is an all-out war, shelling, bullets, tanks, etc. But conflict zones are across the board in terms of their intensity. Conflict zone really could be as simple as walking through the local mall at the lowest intensity level and trying to not have your privacy ruined from just going to the local mall. Now, is that a conflict zone in regards to what we're seeing in Ukraine? Of course not. But is it a conflict in terms of a war for your personal identity and your information and your data and your privacy? It is that. So let's put that at the lowest bottom, 0.5, maybe 1 on the conflict zone. And we'll put Ukraine way at the top right now of 10 on the conflict zone. Regardless, there are operational things that you can do for your personal information security that matter, and you need to figure out which one of these are appropriate for you based on the conflict zone that you might be in. Another example of a conflict zone could be being at a protest. Whether it's in Russia, which is quite intense and very brave of those Russian people to be protesting against their authoritarian leader at this time because we know what's going to happen to them, or being at a protest here in the United States, which is also very brave in situations depending on which side of the argument you're on and who you're facing up against, whether it is counter-protesters, other protesters, or even state-level powers such as the local police. In that regard, these are all conflict zones as well, and OpSec applies. So I'm going to give you just some basic primers, and you have to determine what's appropriate for you. Now, one of the things you need to think about when it comes to this sort of problem is that you need to consider this ahead of time. Trying to deal with some of these problems after you're already in the conflict zone is going to be a very problematic problem. So if you haven't considered this ahead of time, just like you haven't considered learning how to use firearms ahead of time or how to use a fire extinguisher or basic medical training ahead of time, when the situation arises and you're in it, in the thick of it, that's not the time to learn how to use a tourniquet. It's not the time to learn how to aim a gun, and it's not the time to learn how to do personal OpSec. And let's not also forget that your OpSec for your personal life also may affect those around you, depending on the conflict zone you're in. If you're at a protest and you have your phone out, that phone will see other phones in the vicinity. IMEI numbers can be determined, associations, who you're around. Even if you're just there as an observer using your phone, but you're amongst other people and they're using their phones, you could be associated being part of that group, regardless of if you are or not, based on what is emanating from your phone. And let's not forget that corporations and nation states like to collude. So do not think that your phone data is any way secure. It is not secure from the local nation state from which you are dealing with, nor is it secure from oppositional nation states. Hacking and all those things apply. So you also really can't necessarily trust your cell phone provider to not provide data to hostile nation states or other entities. So do not trust that data. The first thing you need to think about is this device right here, this cell phone. Pretty much all of us have them, whether it's iOS, Android, or whatever. Even if you have this thing turned off, you put it in airplane mode, you do all those things, do not trust this device to not be beaconing. Even if you flip it open and only want to take a photograph, there are multiple background services, daemons, things running on this operating system that are probably sending out information. One simple example of that were soldiers that were using their phone to do run tracking on a secret base, and it turned out full maps of the base were made as a result. They didn't think about the metadata leaking out of their phone. But even if you pick this up just to take a picture, well, even in airplane mode, you don't know what this thing is leaking. But let's assume that you're even not in airplane mode. This thing is telling all sorts of things to the world. Your cell phone triangulation data, GPS location, all that is coming in and out of this device. It is not just a receiver, it is a transmitter. Additionally, every photograph you take will have metadata in it, which we're going to get to in a minute. So if you are in a conflict zone, this is a bad idea. This thing is a super bad idea. Now, even if you decide I'm going to get a burner, and that one's not associated to me, right? The minute that burner comes online around other people around you, it will be associated around the people that you are around, as well as if you ever turn this device on next to your burner, there's going to be an association there as well. That type of background data is impossible to stop, and it will be discernible. So this thing, if you're in a real conflict zone, the first solution to this, if you don't have preparations ahead of time, is to lose this. Ditch it. Don't have it. This is not your friend. I know it's filled with a wealth of data and information that you need, but what you can do, and what a lot of people have done, and you have to remember this is also risky as well, is take some of that most important information, perhaps a phone number of someone that you'd be able to contact, or something you just need to have on you, and write it in a relatively indelible marker on your arm. Now, granted, if you're captured by the opposition, whatever that means, of course that data is there, but that is far less data than what they're going to get out of this device. So if you find yourself in a conflict zone without preparation, lose this. Ditch it. There's nothing that will come that's good out of this. That simple photo taken out of Ukraine cost who knows how many lives. This is a bad idea. Now, so if you're thinking ahead of time, here's a simple solution. This is a Faraday bag. This is designed to, once you put it in, no transmissions can come in or out of this bag with this device. So in that regard, if you're ahead of time in a conflict zone, or thinking that you may someday be in one, or just want to prepare for the idea of being in a conflict zone, you need a Faraday bag or a Faraday case or something like that. This is Joey, by the way. Apparently she wants to be in the video. At any rate, I will provide a link. There are tons of these on Amazon. So if you have one of these and you've thought ahead, this goes in here. Seal that thing up, and then you can put that in your pocket. Now, is this thing still a giant repository of dangerous data in your pocket, even if it can't send and transmit? Yes, it is. And if you were to have this taken away from you by whatever that risk might be, consider the situation of what is on this, the vulnerability of it, and how easy it is to get into the data. The first simple solution to that is do not ever use biometric authentication for any device. Fingerprint, Face ID, any of that. You can be compelled to authenticate to the device and unlock it, making their job easier. Obviously, a password that is long and cryptic would be useful. However, you should not consider these devices secure. By plugging them into their Lightning port or USB-C port, there are inevitably vulnerabilities on this device that will leak the data that's on it. So by not using biometrics, you've made their job harder, but you've not stopped them from getting to the data. And consider what is on this device. Once again, one consideration is to not have it with you at all. So one question you have is, but I need my GPS on my phone. Well, one thing you can think ahead about is to get a separate standalone GPS unit that is strictly a receiver, not a transmitter, like an old school Garmin. You should consider, of course, that GPS could be jammed and may not be viable in the environment you're in, and also knowing how to read a simple map on paper and having a lensatic compass would be a useful thing. So lose this or Faraday bag it. Do not consider it a trustworthy or reliable resource. Consider it unsafe and dangerous to have on you. Additionally, if you need GPS, have a receiver only, like an old school Garmin. Also have a lensatic compass and still retain the ability to read maps. So many of us now have gotten used to phones. We plug in an address and it just tells us how to get there. And our simple ability to read a simple map has been really degraded. So consider that an important, useful skill. If you're going to need to take photographs, you need to have a camera, just an old basic school camera. It doesn't necessarily have to be film, but it does have to be something that does not transmit and receive through any form of wireless connectivity, have apps on it, be a smart device. Maybe an old school digital camera that you plug in and download the photos from. You should look into that, however, to make sure that those cameras are not still storing metadata. Like if it, for example, has a GPS receiver on it, every photograph you take will have the GPS coordinates of the photograph location and where it was taken, not only timestamps, etc. So there are ways to strip metadata if you know how to do that. Linux has a tool called exif, for example, in which you can do that. But the better solution would be to have a device that doesn't even capture it in the first place. Also, like I said about the photograph I mentioned earlier in this video in Ukraine, it wasn't even that got them in trouble. It was a photograph of the location that had identifiable features. So keep in mind that identifiable features around you in a photograph, even if you've stripped all of the metadata, can still be highly dangerous. So we've gone through GPS coordinates or GPS devices. We've gone through the risk of a cell phone. We've gone through cameras without connectivity. We've gone through Faraday bags. We've talked about geotagging. But when we get deeper into the photographic issue, one of the other things you should consider is what can be done with the photograph you're sending out. Are there faces in the background? Is your face in the photo? All of those things can be easily sent through analysis, and photographic or essentially biometric identification of people's faces, facial ID, is widespread and common. Once again, providing association to who you are or who you are around or your allies, as well as perhaps even identifiable locations based on where they might know someone exists, like where they live. So in that regard, try to strip faces out of photographs, or if that is something that you are personally worried about, of course, the photograph you take matters. So another thing you need to think about is that type of facial recognition in the field. This applies at the 0 level of the conflict zone, maybe all the way to the top. Walking about in an environment that is highly surveilled, which is most of our planet nowadays, at least in the quote-unquote first world, lack of a better term, has facial ID and recognition everywhere. Every picture you post online, cameras, security cameras, all of that is tied into, or most of it is tied into some sort of facial recognition and facial ID. Depending on what level of intensity conflict zone you're in, it may or may not be relevant or possible to just wear a mask. So in that regard, I'm going to recommend looking into a product. They are really an incredible thing. They look like standard sunglasses, ostensibly, but most of these cameras that do facial recognition use IR, infrared light, of course, which is not visible to the human eye, so they can see both during normal daylight as well as in low light. And these glasses are designed to reflect the IR illumination from the camera in a way that it turns your face into a giant ball of light. A really impressive solution. It's not the only solution. Of course, some sort of mask would be far better, and being considerate of how and what you post on the internet is even more so. You also need to consider your activity on your computer. If you still have internet connectivity, consider that when you're connected to the internet, you are likely emanating your location from the device you're using. There are ways to help solve that, but not completely mitigate that. The simplest and easiest one is something called TOR or Tor, the Onion Routing Network. It is what sometimes is referred to by the scary media as the dark web. What this is a number of nodes all across the planet that are onion routers. Once you connect to the onion router network, you can set, depending on the application you're using, how many hops you want to go through the onion router network before you exit an onion router node onto the internet. Consider it VPN-like, but without having a VPN account. So once you're part of the onion router network and a client on it, you might be in the UK on the onion network, bounce through 8 different onion routers, of which there is hopefully no logging done between them, and your actual egress traffic might come out of, I don't know, let's say Canada. And so that is something to consider. There are just onion router clients that you can install. There are browsers that are directly aligned, that are directly connected, or can be just turned on or off for privacy. But the best solution for this is to not use your standard computer at all. In fact, if you've got a standard computer that you've ever been using for any type of private information, this is another device that, if you have not been proactively considering using encryption to encrypt the entire volume, that you should lose. I'm going to get to that more in a minute. Way back when I was working at an encryption company, I had the opportunity to work with Phil Zimmerman, who was the man who invented PGP, Pretty Good Privacy. And PGP and GPG are still one of the best solutions that you can use for that. I would recommend GPG, the open source solution, rather the PGP one, which is now kind of a corporate tool. And the reason he created that solution was actually because he was aware of people doing research on human rights violations across the world, and when they were caught by the local warlord, their laptop was filled with information and data about people that they'd interview about these human rights violations. And of course, as you can assume, retribution applied shortly thereafter. So Phil wrote PGP, pretty good privacy, so that human rights activists could encrypt the data on their laptop, and if they were captured by the adversary, that data would be useless ciphertext to that person, or to that opposition or that enemy, and therefore protect their sources. You should consider that as well. I still highly recommend GPG. And if you have not already figured out some form of whole volume encryption or are competent in the use of GPG, then it is too late already. And that laptop that you've been using currently is a dangerous resource filled with personal information. You should probably lose it. The next thing you can do, though, is have another device, which is just a sterile laptop that has never been used for anything personal, and you can make a live install on a USB drive, for example, of Tails, Tails. It is an operating system designed for privacy. It is ephemeral, meaning that as you use it, it stores no data locally. It stores no data to the thumb drive. It has a lot of the security tools you need in it, browsers, onion router, encryption, etc. And when you are done using that, you can just take that thumb drive out, put it in your pocket, turn off the computer, and nothing is stored locally on the computer or the thumb drive of any of your activity. So if you were to need to connect to the internet, a sterile laptop using an ephemeral live version of an OS, specifically something like Tails, would be your safest way to, or one of the safer ways to do so. That does not mean it is safe, but it is one of the safer ways to do so. If you're going to be in an environment where there's probably going to be pepper spray deployed, a nice good quantity of milk of magnesia nearby will help. Milk of magnesia is one of the best things you can do to treat people or yourself who have been hit with pepper spray. It neutralizes it better than a lot of other things, and so having a good amount of milk of magnesia nearby just to deal with those type of chemical weapons, and there's Joey again, will help you out. So in regards, what I want to say about this video is wholly here as a primer. It is by no means conclusive. It is by no means in depth. These are just things you need to consider, and I would advise you to consider them before you land up in a conflict zone, even though I think all of us ostensibly are sort of in a conflict zone at this point already, depending on your intensity level. Like I said, in Ukraine, intensity level 10. For me right now, intensity level 0. All I'm worried about is my personal privacy when I'm out and about in public, which is a lot better, of course, than being shelled because the photo you posted landed up on Reddit. I hope this video inspires some thought, makes you consider some of the things you need to do to protect yourself, others, and those you care about. And I will put some links in the description below for some of these items, not all of them. But I want to remind you that InRange is completely Patreon supported. Patreon.com/InRangeTV. No sponsors, no overlords. This is not the kind of content that you're going to get sponsored by really any vendor, right? This is the kind of stuff that I do because I'm completely crowdsourced by people like you. So thanks for watching. Good luck out there.